This is Let's Read, Place-Based Learning and Knowing, Critical Pedagogies Grounded in Indigeneity by J.T. Johnson. It was published in a journal called GeoJournal, which I assume is geography or place-focused, in the year 2012. Abstract. For Indigenous people, knowledge and science are written onto the landscape our languages talk into being through individual and collective consciousness of our communities. Our landscapes are the storied histories, cosmogonies, philosophies, and sciences of those indigenous knowledges which are increasingly being pushed aside by the gray uniformity of globalization and its progenitor, European colonization. It is within storied places that we can still glimpse alternatives to this gray uniformity of globalization, which brings with it a rhetoric of capitalism, modernism, abstract space, and Western science. It is this rhetoric produced through globalization which erases the storied landscapes, destroying the libraries embedded within indigenous toponyms, creating a terra nullius, an empty land awaiting a colonial or neo-colonial history and economy. As Paulo Freire has challenged us to see, critical consciousness requires us to, quote, read our world, end quote, decoding the images of our concrete, situated experiences with the world. A critical pedagogy of place recognizes the concrete experiences of communities grounded in shared histories, stories, and challenges based within a politics of place. A critical pedagogy of place seeks to decolonize and re-inhabit the storied landscapes through reading the ways in which Indigenous peoples' places and environment have been injured and exploited. This paper seeks to discuss how through reading the places in the world as political texts, one may engage in reflection and practice in order to understand and, where necessary, to change the world. Introduction. This is a quote from an author named Ortiz. It says, "Being and place are conceptually linked. This is an indigenous principle and therefore is maintained as such with indigenous cultural philosophy and expressed in the most common or ordinary way." End quote. In comments on a recent grant application, I was chastised for failing to define place, as if the term had become specialist language. I responded to the comment, much as Tim Cresswell has stated at the beginning of his book, Place, A Short Introduction, quote, "Place is not a specialized piece of academic terminology," end quote. Of course, I must admit, as does Cresswell, that place is also a complex set of concepts debated from numerous perspectives, exposed to the intellectual rigors of philosophy and the social sciences, with a myriad of definitions. Perhaps my failure to define place in my 3-page grant application stemmed more from the impossibility to define such a complex term within such a short grant application, but it was also based on the idea that place is taken for granted and, of course, that it should not need definition. Some human geographers, along with social scientists and other disciplines, have, over the past few decades, increasingly employed place as a concept within their work. Unfortunately, though, much of this work has left place ill-defined, not distinguished at all, or as synonymous with space. John Agnew has defined 3 principal meanings for place as it has been employed within human geography. First, place as location or specific point on the earth. Second, as a set sense of place or the subjective feelings people have about places, including the roles that they play in identity formation. Third, place as a locale or setting and scale for everyday life, what Tim Ingold refers to as taskscapes. In this paper, in an effort to narrow and more clearly define the discussion, I will focus on 2 conceptualizations of place. First, place as a way of understanding, knowing, and learning about the world, and second, as the embodied location of everyday struggle for meaning, political, cultural, and economic. The 2 meanings I have embraced do not fit neatly within the principal meanings outlined by Agnew, just as the direction I intend to take in this paper lies, at least somewhat, outside the mainstream of human geography. They do, however, fit well within a broadly defined indigenous conceptualization of place and hopefully will lead toward reading and understanding places as political texts with indigenous people's daily struggles. As Gregory Cajete has described, quote, "Native cultures are the earth, air, fire, water, and spirit of the place from which they evolved," end quote. Next section, place and placelessness. Quote, "Our cultural experience is placed in geography of our everyday lives and in the ecology and the diverse relationships that take place within and between places," end quote. As David Grunwald states in the above quote, "Our cultural experience, including our ecological relationships, are placed in the geography of our everyday lives. Unfortunately, just as place has become a taken-for-granted concept, so also have been the places in our cultural landscape become taken for granted. This taken for granted relationship has allowed specific places to become only thinly conceived or erased entirely. Placelessness, many authors have noted, is a primary component of our modern Western condition. Carolyn Merchant describes this placelessness as a byproduct of the Enlightenment meta-narrative, which serves to divide culture from nature, leading to a loss of connection to our places, to our environments, to our landscapes, and to the knowledge stored within these landscapes. Many may consider a discussion of placelessness as a trite, cliched approach, particularly for a paper which hopes to address some issues pertinent to the struggle of indigenous peoples in the 21st century. Unfortunately, though, quote, the ontological and epistemological legacies of European colonialism based within Enlightenment thought are highly resistant, end quote. Eurocentric thinking, broadly speaking, is based on a dualistic and reductionist structure which divides the world into distinguishable segments with supposedly essential differences, what Bill Ashcroft refers to as imperial binary. I am arguing here that placelessness, in addition to being founded within a dualistic meta-narrative which separates culture and civilization from nature, also serves to disconnect Western science and scientists from indigenous struggles, from indigenous ways of learning and knowing the world, and ultimately disconnects us from engaging a place-based critical consciousness in our work. Place, rather than an abstract space, is a location endowed with meaning. Placemaking, as Keith Basso has described, does not require special sensibilities or cultivated skills. It is a common response to common curiosities. What happened here? Who was involved? What was it like? Why should it matter? And anyone can be a placemaker who has the inclination. Everyone, I would argue, does in fact partake in making places. Despite modern Western society's placelessness, there continues to be the ability to make places, and continually we're creating meaning within places in our daily landscape. It is impossible for us to dwell within our landscape, and here I'm using the verb dwell in keeping with Heidegger's use of the word, which he defines as, quote, to cherish and protect, to preserve and care for, end quote, the landscape. Or as Tim Ingold describes the process of active engagement with the landscape as taskscapes, without gathering meaning from the place encountered. When I attempt to teach the concept of placemaking to undergraduate students, I frequently ask them to remember their weekend outings and how they have described them later to those not present. The who, what, and when of these events inevitably becomes attached to the where. These events, remembered attached to a place, forever alter the memory of that place. Despite the fact that we're continually making places through our active engagement with our landscape, I would argue that what is missing from our place world is a connection to the significant cultural histories and moralities, which, once upon a time, were stored within our storied landscapes. The significant depth of meaning attached to places has been displaced by a thinner layer of meaning. As Pierce Lewis has argued, our landscape is our unwitting autobiography, the unwitting nature of this autobiography should be troubling. The placemaking of our modern society creates only a thin layer of meaning, unlike the thicker depths of meaning attached to place by indigenous oral societies. As Keith Basso has eloquently shown, for societies without writing, place serves as a primary repository for history. As one of his Apache research collaborators stated, quote, they came to this country long ago, our ancestors did. They hadn't seen it before. They knew nothing about it. Everything was unfamiliar to them. They were poor. They had few possessions, and surviving was difficult for them. They were looking for a good place to settle in a safe place without enemies. They were searching. They were traveling all over, stopping here and there, noticing everything, looking at the land. They knew nothing about it and did not know what they would find. None of the places had names then. None of them did. And as the people went about, they thought about this, quote, how shall we speak about this land, quote, they said, and, quote, how shall we speak about where we have been and where we want to go, end quote. Western society and our historians no longer use place as the primary repository for their narratives. Our spatial events have been replaced with a historical stage upon which history itself creates a narrative merely repeated by the onlooker historian, quote, a fabric woven of self-reinforcing illusions, end quote. Our written texts and the tools of literacy have enabled greater mobility for our knowledge production system, a system we sometimes arrogantly refer to as a universal science. Occasionally, although our places are no longer primary repositories of our history, we do remember our significant events by remembering their place names: Gettysburg, Chernobyl, Fallujah. Next section, place-based learning and knowing. Quote, each of us is a product of a lifetime of environmental and cultural education that includes our embodied experiences of place, end quote. While teaching at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand, I was asked to assist with a course entitled Maori and Indigenous Science. One task I took on early in the course was to discuss the comparability of various knowledge systems, including Western science. As David Turnbull has described, quote, though knowledge systems may differ in their epistemologies, methodologies, logics, cognitive structures, and in their socioeconomic contexts, a characteristic that they all share is their localness, end quote. No matter how adamantly one argues that Western science is universal and therefore placeless science, even our physicists and biologists have begun to admit that experiments always vary to some degree from location to location. The act of observation alters how even the smallest particle will behave in the laboratory. By detaching our histories, our stories, and our science from place, Western science has developed an arrogance which seeks to elevate it above other knowledge systems, particularly those knowledge systems which have remained more attached to place. As Turnbull has helped us understand, all knowledge systems, Western science included, are local place-based knowledges. The experience of dwelling in the taskscapes our dwelling create impact our knowledge production. To paraphrase Ingold, it is only because we dwell therein that we can think the thoughts we do. The knowledge we create is inevitably affected by the landscape surrounding us and is a creation of our combined communal taskscapes. Perhaps more importantly, the landscape we carry with us, continually remembered and retold, the landscape which has played a part in our education, alters how we see the world around us and how we engage in the social production of knowledge. How do we store common history? How do we convey important information, passing it on for future generations? Why do we erase the stories of our place in favor of the stories of our texts? One afternoon, while working on a dissertation at the University of Hawaii, my colleague Renee Louie and I began discussing the divide we perceive between two groups we decided to call people of place and people of text. People of place construct and maintain narratives attached to places. Frequently, the place name descriptors serve as mnemonic devices, standing for narratives which describe and inform a right relationship between the individual, the community, and the non-human landscape. N. Scott Momaday has described this right relationship as reciprocal appropriation, the gathering of sustenance and meaning from the landscape while incorporating and maintaining an identity based upon the landscape. People of text have removed their histories and narratives from places, instead storing them within a text. As Giselle Burns has described, quote, by erasing distance, the written word allows the writer actually to be in two places at once, his body in one and his thoughts in the other, end quote. As the writer writes, she is not only erasing distance, but also storied landscapes. Burns has noted that, quote, space becomes place simply by being named. In other words, place is space to which meaning is ascribed, end quote. If the statement is true, then its corollary must also be true, and the erasure or removal of meaning from place allows the creation of an abstract space void of meaning. For place in the landscape, places with significant longer histories, with roles to play in the preservation of these histories, for these places to change into spaces and to take on a resource role in the colonial and capitalist endeavor, then the longer history must be erased. Once void of its previous history and culture, these newly emptied spaces are ready to be filled with settlers, crops, cattle, and industry. The longer histories created and maintained by indigenous historians were systematically erased by European colonialism, creating a tabula rasa, a blank landscape upon which a new story and history could be written. For those of us in the Western United States, this new story is lined by the Public Land Survey and Thomas Jefferson's vision of an army of yeoman farmers who would bring Western civilization, and perhaps more importantly, order, to a landscape littered with half-buried indigenous histories. Next section, called Finding Common Ground. Quote, even the most liberal universities operate in ways that place substantial domains of human experience, thought, and insight outside the conventional bounds of legitimate knowledge. As anyone who's ever questioned the singular use of terms such as epistemology and ontology has been informed, Western science intends itself to be the universal set of boundaries governing what is knowable about our world and universe. The reality, of course, is that people relate to, interpret, and make meaning of the world around them in a multitude of ways. Acknowledging that an ontological diversity does exist and, quote, taking seriously the philosophies and experiences of indigenous groups, end quote, is a first step toward finding a common ground upon which a dialogue between knowledge systems can take place. Perhaps more importantly, though, acknowledging the multiplicity of the ways in which various peoples explore and conceive of the world is fundamental to reversing the atomistic approach within Western science. As Brian Merton and I have argued in an early article, quote, perhaps place offers a common ground between Western and indigenous thought, end quote. This will require us, though, to acknowledge the importance of place for many epistemologies and reincorporate place as one method of rewriting the Enlightenment meta-narrative, as Carolyn Merchant has challenged us to do. Just as physicists such as David Bohm have already done, social scientists and humanists are beginning to find bridges between modernism's binary reductionism and the holistic approaches common to indigenous epistemologies. Anthropologists, environmental historians, and eco-lit authors such as Carolyn Merchant, Bill Cronin, and Loris Buell are attempting to bridge the divide between culture and nature, tearing down the city walls and its artificial liminality. Likewise, some philosophers, anthropologists, and geographers are attempting to bring Western thought back toward place and away from abstract space. As Edward Casey has written, quote, is it not time to face place, to confront it, take off its veil, and see its full face? With space, we attach meaning to the world around us, perpetuating an artificial separation between humanity and the world in which we live and dwell. Not until we begin examining our landscape and the places within that landscape do we begin gathering meaning to us from the world. As Loris Buell observes, quote, place is not just a noun, but also a verb of action, end quote. When we are engaged with a place, we're carrying out an act of remembrance, a retelling of the stories written there, while also continually rewriting these stories. Being in place is continually an act of engaged, active learning. Each place name acts as a mnemonic device, helping us remember the story associated with that toponym. Each story is a text within the meta-narrative of a particular culture, aiding through its remembrance the continual recreation of that society. We can look out across our landscape, seeing a series of place names, remembering the stories associated with creating and recreating our culture. I would argue that this storied landscape is the equivalent of a library. Its place knowledge serves as a repository for the narratives, which through an oral literacy are employed to access the knowledge produced within a knowledge system which values being in place. It is the struggle to protect place and all of its wisdom, learning, knowing associated with places that leads us not only to place-based struggles for community self-determination, but also for the protection and continuity of community knowledge. Here I'm arguing that cultural survival is, as some sociologists have observed, at least in part a preservation of non-Western scientific knowledge. Indigenous language programs, sacred site mapping, and studies of place names are not merely cultural preservation programs. They're also crucial in preserving the extensive data set associated with Indigenous and place knowledges. Place-based struggle is hopefully then more than just a defense of resource and local economies, but also a defense of history, knowledge, and science. Next section, a critical pedagogy grounded in indigeneity. Quote, increasingly, I am convinced that despite problems of appropriation, Native, Indigenous, First Nations, and Aboriginal education processes and epistemologies need to be at the center of place-based, culturally responsive teaching. Only through studying Native experiences will educators understand the enduring legacy of colonization and the possibility for diverse cultural ways of being. At this point in the paper, I'm shifting away from the work of anthropologists, philosophers, and geographers to bring in the work of critical educators. Within this literature, perhaps one of the most significant theorists and activists is Paulo Freire. Freire, trained as a philosopher and lawyer, decided to work as an educator, and through this work, developed a model for bringing written literacy to poor rural Brazilians. His experience in the Amazon aided Freire in envisioning his now world-famous concept of conscientização, or critical consciousness. His literacy program became a pedagogy not only about literacy, but more crucially concerned with the, quote, decolonization of the mind, end quote. Freire's phenomenological foundations are clear in this quote from Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is the book he authored. Quote, human beings are because they are in a situation, and they will be more, the more they not only critically reflect upon their existence, but critically act upon it, end quote. I want to stretch, although in reality it's not a long stretch at all, Freire's process of attaining critical consciousness as a popular culture and identity to being a place-based process. Developing critical consciousness, I am arguing, means uncovering our place-based knowledge and acknowledging it as a significant part of our ontology. Recovery of place connections means recognizing the importance of particular places within our lives. Protection of place-based knowledge means recovering place names and their associated stories and continuing to protect and encourage Indigenous language skill. The struggle to understand Indigenous knowledge systems requires us to unseat Western science from its high perch and engage in comparing knowledge systems on a level playing field. As McLaren and Garreau, two critical educators in the Freirean tradition, observe, critical pedagogies are inherently pedagogies of place. To understand the place-based struggles of Indigenous communities requires an engagement with the pedagogies created by that place, the experiences, problems, languages, and histories these communities rely upon to construct a narrative of collective identity. To be engaged in the struggles of communities, even within our research, challenges us to hope for the possibility of transformation. David Grunwald, another critical educator, describes two aims for articulating a pedagogy of place, critical pedagogy of place. First, to, quote, identify, recover, and create material spaces and places that teach us how to live well in our environments, rehabilitation, and second, to identify and change ways of thinking that injure and exploit other peoples and places, decolonization, end quote. Central to, or perhaps underlying my thesis today, is indigeneity. As Ward Churchill has described, I intend through this paper, quote, to take the rights of Indigenous peoples as a highest priority, to draw on the traditions, the bodies of knowledge and corresponding codes of values, evolved over many thousands of years by Native people the world over, end quote. In this way, my focus is not just about recovering place, but bringing on the knowledges, struggles, and rights of Indigenous people to the forefront. I believe that within our place-based struggles, one might glimpse alternative economies, politics and environmental management methods, informed by alternative knowledge systems and epistemologies. Accessing this information requires us, though, to recognize Indigenous knowledge, respect its place foundation, and reciprocate in our own knowledge production by sharing with those who share their knowledge with us. Another reason for fronting indigeneity is that although knowledge systems are in fact local and placed, Western science has worked diligently over the past few centuries in cultivating the myth of its universality or hypermobility. Part of the arrogance of Western science has been that it, quote, sets itself within a hall of mirrors, mistakes its reflection for the world, sees its own reflection endlessly, talks endlessly to itself, and not surprisingly, finds continual verification of itself and its worldview, end quote. Western science will need to break free of this, quote, hall of mirrors, end quote, and reaffirm the existence and values of other knowledge systems. In order for the academy to find its way back into place, we have to have assistance. There will be need for dialogue with place-connected knowledge systems. For this dialogue to occur, we need to create an ethical space, which Willie Ermine describes as a process which seeks, quote, substantial, sustained, and ethical moral understanding, end quote, while affirming and sometimes significant differences between cultures, worldviews, and knowledge systems. This recovery of place within Western thought will need to find common ground with other place epistemologies. It will also need to embrace those anthropologists, geographers, ecological humanists, and philosophers who are using phenomenology as a bridge between Indigenous and Western philosophies of place. It will need to acknowledge, as Jones and Cloak have, that a phenomenological approach, quote, offers a way to deal with the richness of place, where the ecological and the cultural, the human and the non-human, the local and the global, the real and the imaginary, all become bound together in particular formations of particular places, end quote. Finding a place for Indigenous knowledges within the Academy and our research initiatives will require us to understand the importance of place within Indigenous epistemologies. To engage Indigenous knowledge systems requires a place-to-place pedagogy, a place-connected approach. To engage our research with the struggles of Indigenous communities requires a critical approach to understanding the place-based struggles of Indigenous communities. As Freire instructs, to engage with the community requires us to engage with the place-specific ways of knowing and the place and that community. If there are those who would argue against this place-based focus surrounding Indigenous struggles, I would reply, much as Noel Castre has, that the real projects erect strong boundaries around places, in both the imagination and practice, should not be necessarily deemed acts of geographical folly by those on the geographical left. In this process of placed engagement, there is promise of healing of placelessness within our academic epistemologies and methodologies. The healing will hopefully serve to expand our abilities to critically engage as geographers and educators. Healing placelessness also holds out the hope of developing an autochthonous identity, an identity which springs from a reciprocal relationship with our place in the world. The end.